It might be the single biggest loss to taxpayers in Victoria's history. The Auditor-General has found bungling of last year's pokey licences cost the state more than $3 billion. The real winners were the big pokey barons. In a moment we'll hear from Gaming Minister Michael O'Brien, but first here's Anne McDonald.
They're one of Victoria's biggest revenue raisers. Tens of thousands of poker machines around the state inject billions of dollars into public coffers each year. But the Auditor-General has exposed major failings in what was supposed to be the biggest ever industry shake-up, and many aren't surprised.
Both the venues and the government could have walked away with about the same amount of money without anyone taking a loss, but the amount of harm being done in Victoria could have been dramatically reduced. They didn't do that.
The report found the sale of 30,000 poker machine licences for pubs and clubs was predicted to reap $4.5 billion. What the government actually earned from the deal was just $980 million.
As far as I can see, it would have to be one of the biggest bungles in terms of the sale of a public right, which is what a poker machine licence is. As I said, it's a licence to print money, and these were all sold at effectively bargain basement prices.
It was the former Labor state government that announced the shake-up. The Tattersalls and Tabcorp duopoly would be scrapped to make way for a venue operator system. It was designed to give pubs and clubs more control and reduce problem gambling. Clubs were supposed to get a head start on the big hotels. They were allowed to buy the licences first, followed by an auction for the remaining clubs and hotels.
The smaller clubs didn't have the opt-out, didn't have the organisational ability, they didn't have the information, they didn't have the expertise, and they didn't have the experience to compete in this incredibly complicated process which the government designed. But the big organisations like ALH and the AFL clubs, they cleaned up. They cleaned up very big time.
Everybody was, basically, well, not forced into, but you're put in a corner where you had to take up that auction, that offer to ensure you had something going forward. And this has put a lot of pressure on some clubs. There's some clubs that are really struggling at the moment.
Des Barnard is the manager of the St Albans Sports Club in Melbourne's West. He, along with every other small club in Victoria, battled with a complex new system. Not knowing how he'd fare at the auction, he decided to buy the majority of the club's entitlements at the pre-auction allocation. He walked away with 20 entitlements totalling $1.8 million, or $90,000 each. But at the auction 6 months later, licences were snapped up by some for less than $10,000. The big winners were the major pokey owners, including Bruce Matheson and Woolworths, who own the ALH Group. The Auditor-General's report found they snagged a bargain after the state government set an extremely low reserve price.
Woolworths and the ALH Group with Mr Matheson will dominate the poker machine business in Victoria, as they have been for some years, in the place of Tattersalls and Tabcorp. So instead of having two giants operating around the traps, we'll have one.
I think it's trite to say hotels have been big winners. It was an auction process. The price paid reflected the value that the hoteliers thought lay in what was on offer.
Brian Carney says the Auditor-General was commercially naive by not considering the volatile cost and revenue structure of the state's gaming industry.
From July 2012, automatic tallying machines will be totally removed from gaming venues. There will be pre-commitment requirements introduced on all gaming machines from 2014. Our estimates of the impact of those interventions is up to 40% in terms of the effect on revenues.
But the Auditor-General is adamant it was the large venue operators rather than the community who benefited from this windfall gain. The report is scathing of the Department of Justice, which oversaw the sale. Its secretary, Penny Armitage, wouldn't be interviewed by 7:30 Victoria. Despite the Auditor-General's findings, there's no avenue for the small clubs to recoup their losses. The current arrangements will be in place for the next decade.
It's a fairly trying time for everybody right through to now, and we'll be through till August next year when everything's got to change from having basically a big brother looking after you to sort of looking after things yourself.